At one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, Dr. Margaret Holloway's advanced calculus class was renowned not only for her sharp mathematical intellect, but also for her unmistakable political views. That morning, as students filed into the large lecture hall, the air felt taut with invisible tension. Instead of the usual complex equations, the whiteboard displayed a simple phrase: today's topic, redefining academic priorities. Seated quietly in the back row was a tall, reserved young man dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit. Few in the class knew much about him, as he preferred to keep to himself. But no one was unfamiliar with his name, Barron Trump. What they didn't know was that behind his discreet demeanor lay a mathematical mind about to shake the very foundations of that lecture hall. Dr. Holloway stepped onto the podium, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room, scrutinizing each student. Her voice rang out, cold and resolute. Mathematics, while important, must make room for more meaningful social discussions. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances, but Barron remained still, his expression calm yet piercing as he slowly raised his hand. Dr. Holloway's eyes narrowed with subtle defiance. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge her today. Instead of pausing, she pressed on, her tone tinged with condescension. In today's world, abstract theories matter less than applying knowledge to issues of social justice. A PowerPoint slide appeared, not mathematical formulas, but charts highlighting gender disparities in STEM fields. Some of you here, she added, her gaze landing squarely on Barron, might need to accept that your privileged position doesn't necessarily reflect true merit. Barron's hand remained raised, steady as a silent testament to his patience. A few heads turned toward him, some nodding slightly, seemingly grateful that someone had the courage to speak up. The silence grew heavier until Dr. Holloway, unable to ignore him any longer, finally addressed him. "Yes, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice laced with both sarcasm and irritation. "Do you have something to share about privilege and education?" Barron calmly lowered his hand and stood, his composure unwavering, his eyes alight with quiet confidence. "Dr. Holloway," he began, his voice clear and steady, "I believe calculus is an essential foundation for understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us in this room chose this advanced course specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum inadvertently hinder the academic growth of all students, regardless of their background?" A few students nodded in agreement, appreciating the sharp logic of his argument. Dr. Holloway's face tightened, her expression hardening like steel. "Mr. Trump," she replied sharply, emphasizing his last name, "perhaps you should take the time to understand how privilege shapes educational systems. Not everyone has the luxury of private tutors or attends elite prep schools like you." What happened next left the room stunned. Barron didn't falter, didn't retreat into defensiveness. Instead, he smiled gently, his gaze steady and warm, yet razor-sharp. "You're right, Professor. I've been fortunate in my education, and precisely because of that, I believe we have a responsibility to uphold high academic standards so that everyone, no matter their circumstances, has the opportunity to reach their full potential." Dr. Holloway's face flushed, not with rage, but with the sting of encountering an unexpected, composed rebuttal. "And you think you know better than me about maintaining academic standards?" she shot back with a cold, mocking laugh. "What makes you qualified to lecture me about mathematical education?" Barron's demeanor remained unchanged. His reply was simple, direct, and disarmingly calm. "I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political boundaries." The classroom fell into a charged silence, not of tension, but of awe. In that moment, it was clear that this was no ordinary student, and this was no ordinary lecture. The classroom fell into silence, but it wasn't an empty, hollow quiet. It was the silence of respect beginning to kindle. of shifting thoughts stirring in the minds of every student. Barron motioned toward the blank whiteboard, his gaze sharp yet composed. Instead of debating privilege, can't we spend this time exploring the intricate beauty of calculus? The room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Holloway's eyes narrowed, sharp as daggers. She slowly walked toward the whiteboard, picking up a marker with a cold, calculated confidence. "Very well, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "If you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test." She began writing on the board. Bold, decisive strokes formed a problem that drew gasps from a few students. This wasn't an ordinary calculus problem. It was a multi-variable integral, so complex that even graduate students would struggle with it. But Dr. Holloway didn't realize she had just opened a door that would change everything. The equations sprawled across the board, filled with challenging integrals and series expansions. "Since you're so concerned with maintaining academic standards," she added with a sly smirk, her eyes glinting with challenge, "why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd rather go back to discussing your privileged background." The classroom was dead silent. Some students shifted uncomfortably, sensing this was an open attempt to humiliate him. "That's graduate-level material," someone whispered. But Barron didn't flinch. His face remained calm, like stone against crashing waves. He stood up, his voice steady and unwavering. "Of course, I'd be happy to try." As Barron walked to the front of the class, Dr. Holloway's smug grin grew wider. She had chosen this problem precisely because it required techniques far beyond the current curriculum. Yet something in Barron's serene demeanor made that grin falter ever so slightly. Barron accepted the marker from her, his eyes glinting with genuine interest, not fear. A few students leaned forward, sensing something unexpected was about to unfold. "Before I begin," Barron said, his voice resonating through the quiet room, "I notice this problem can be approached in several ways. Would you prefer I use the standard method, or would you like to see a more efficient solution I discovered while studying Leibniz's original papers?" Dr. Holloway froze, her brows furrowing. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" "Yes," Barron replied, a faint smile flickering on his lips. "In German, translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology." He turned back to the board, gripping the marker with unwavering confidence. "But perhaps," he added softly, "we should let the mathematics speak for itself." The room descended into a profound silence. As Barron began to write the first lines of his solution, no one, not even Dr. Holloway, could predict what was about to happen. His strokes flowed smoothly, each line precise, as if the numbers were etched into his mind. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was bringing it to life. Every step was clear, deliberate, and remarkably elegant. "This first step," Barron explained, his voice warm yet sharp, "uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. It simplifies what seems complex into something more approachable." Dr. Holloway stood frozen, her eyes betraying a flicker of surprise. Between steps, Barron would pause, ensuring the class could follow his logic. He wasn't just solving the equation, he was teaching it like a master. Many students pulled out their phones to record the moment. Even those who usually struggled with calculus found themselves grasping his approach with clarity. Now, Barron paused at a pivotal juncture, turning to Dr. Holloway. "We have two paths forward. The traditional method would require another board, but I can demonstrate a more refined approach based on Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer, Professor?" Dr. Holloway stood rooted to the spot. Her earlier confidence evaporated. The question wasn't just about mathematical preference. It was a gentle, yet profound reminder of the humility required in the face of true knowledge. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, A hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could we see both?" asked Sarah Carter, one of the quietest students. Honestly, the way he's explaining this is helping me understand last week's material better." Barron offered Sarah a warm smile, then turned to Dr. Holloway with a thoughtful, almost inviting look. Her response wouldn't just reveal her mathematical expertise, it would reflect her growth as an educator. Just as Dr. Holloway was about to respond, the classroom door burst open with a sharp bang. Dean Anderson, one of her closest academic allies, stepped in, his face marked with seriousness. "Margaret," he announced firmly, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Holloway, or perhaps it was the lifeline she had been silently hoping for. "We'll continue this discussion another time," she said, attempting to regain control of the situation. But before she could turn away, Barron's voice rang out, low, steady, yet filled with undeniable authority. Even Dean Anderson paused in mid-step. "Professor," Barron called, "you challenge me to solve this problem in front of the entire class. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Dean Anderson's brow furrowed, the tension in the air almost tangible. "Young man," the dean started, but Barron cut in gently yet firmly, his tone respectful but razor-sharp. "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron replied, his gaze unwavering. "I'm simply stating a fact. Dr. Holloway issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accepted. The only question left is, will she honour her own challenge?" The classroom was taut with silence, stretched like a wire ready to snap. Many students instinctively reached for their phones, sensing they were witnessing a moment that could become historic. Dr. Holloway looked trapped, caught between the expectations of her ally and the consequences of her own choices. Dean Anderson shifted uneasily, unsure whether to assert his authority or step back. Then Barron did something unexpected. He held out the marker to Dr. Holloway. "Or perhaps," he added with a soft, almost disarming smile, "you'd prefer to show us your solution first? After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections don't matter. Only knowledge does. And surely as our professor, you can solve the problem you presented." The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Dr. Holloway stared at the marker in her hand, realizing she had walked straight into a trap of her own making. Dean Anderson's presence was no longer a rescue, it was another witness to what was about to unfold. The atmosphere grew heavier as Dr. Holloway gripped the marker, her knuckles whitening. Dean Anderson shifted again, sensing that this was no longer a simple classroom dispute. Dr. Holloway began, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she glanced at the complex equation she had written. The very equation she had chosen to humiliate a student now hung over her like a blade. "Perhaps," Barron offered gently, "we could solve it together." His voice carried no mockery, no triumph, just a genuine offer to turn this tense moment into something constructive. But Dr. Holloway's pride wouldn't allow her to accept the olive branch. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, throwing the marker down. "This entire display is just a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." Dean Anderson stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation. "Let's all take a moment to—" "No," Barron interjected, his voice firm as he calmly picked up the marker. "Let's move forward." Turning back to the board, Barron launched into a display of mathematical brilliance that left the entire class speechless. In under 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and Leibniz's approach, with flawless precision. As he wrote the final line, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the room. Even Dean Anderson couldn't mask his astonishment. But what happened next shifted not just the dynamics of the classroom, but the entire department. Dr. Holloway's face had gone from flushed red to pale white. The carefully constructed narrative she had clung to was unraveling before her very eyes. But Barron wasn't done, and his next words proved that true leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about building bridges. Barron turned from the board to face both Dr. Holloway and Dean Anderson. "The beauty of mathematics," he said. He said it doesn't care about our politics, our backgrounds, or our biases. It only cares about truth. He gestured toward his solutions. These equations don't just teach us about calculus, they teach us about learning itself. When we let our prejudices cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow. Dean Anderson cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that—" "Understand what?" a voice called from the back of the room. It was Michael Bush, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. "We should learn less maths because of someone's political agenda." Many students began to stand up. "I came here to learn calculus," one student spoke firmly, "not to be lectured about privileges I'm supposedly benefiting from." The control Dr. Holloway had meticulously built over her classroom was unraveling. But instead of letting her be further humiliated, Barron did something extraordinary. "Professor," he said, his voice cutting through the growing murmurs, "your mathematical knowledge is profound. I've learned a lot from your technical lectures. Perhaps we can focus on that. I'd be more than happy to support other students after class, combining your theoretical expertise with practical applications." His offer hung in the air, a bridge between wounded pride and a chance for redemption. Dean Anderson watched intently, recognizing this moment could spiral into a public relations disaster, or unexpectedly become an inspiring story. Dr. Holloway looked at Barron, then at her students, truly seeing them, perhaps for the first time. Their eyes weren't passive anymore. They burned with curiosity, frustration, and hope. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. She began, then paused, taking a deep breath and standing straighter, as if shedding the weight of her pride. "I made a grave mistake." That admission hit the room like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through every heart present. But her voice carried no defensiveness, only raw, genuine humility. "For years, I've been so focused on fighting what I perceived as privilege that I became exactly what I opposed, a person who judges others based on assumptions instead of merit." She looked at Barron, her eyes now filled with sincere respect. "You didn't just solve that problem, you taught me a lesson about true leadership." Dean Anderson stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to frame this moment positively. "Perhaps this could serve as a model for other departments," he suggested with a faint smile. But before he could spin it into an administrative victory, a wave of commotion erupted outside the classroom. Students from other classes had gathered in the hallway, those who had seen the viral videos spreading online in real time. Some held hastily scribbled signs, "Teach math, not politics," and "Merit over bias." The situation was on the brink of chaos, yet once again, Barron rose to the occasion. He walked to the door, facing the swelling crowd. His gaze was steady, his voice strong yet calm. "You're here to learn," he said with natural authority. "Come in, there's plenty of room." Students poured in, filling every available space. Dr. Holloway watched in awe, witnessing the transformation of a classroom she once controlled with rigidity, now thriving under the spirit of freedom and a genuine hunger for knowledge. Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. Now," he said, his eyes sweeping over eager faces, "who wants to learn about the real-world applications of calculus?" What unfolded over the next hour became legend within the university. But the true story wasn't about equations or politics. It was about something far more powerful. Something just beginning. The story of what happened in Dr. Holloway's calculus class spread across campus like wildfire, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of a tale of conflict and humiliation, it transformed into something inspiring and transformative. In the weeks that followed, enrollment in the advanced calculus class tripled. Students didn't just come to learn math, they came to witness an extraordinary partnership. Dr. Holloway, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion, mathematics. And Barron, true to his word, began hosting study sessions, bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. But the biggest change wasn't in the curriculum, it was in the classroom culture. The class became a place where questions were welcomed, merit truly mattered, and learning transcended political divides. Students who once felt intimidated by both the subject and the atmosphere now thrived. One day, as Barron was helping a struggling student grasp a difficult concept, Dr. Holloway approached him. "You know," she said, her voice softer than ever, "you could have destroyed my career that day, but instead you helped me save it." She paused, then added, "Your father would be proud." Barron's response reflected wisdom beyond his years. "My goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor. My goal was to lift everyone up." Today, that calculus class serves as a reminder that true education isn't about power struggles or political agendas. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to do so with grace. Not just Barron Trump, but many of the outstanding students from that class continue to help others who struggle, believing that the privilege of learning is something every student deserves. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.